We are getting a massive wave of Clash Royale balance changes for January. Now, I normally don't cover balance changes on this channel, but this update is just so massive that I had to talk about it. There are 23 cards that are being balanced, whether it's buffs, nerfs, or even reworks. So let's go ahead and dive right in. First up, we have the Archer Queen, who is getting a 13% nerf to her ability cooldown. It previously took 15 seconds to cool down. Now it will be 2 seconds longer at 17 seconds. The Cannon Cart is getting 2 changes. Its shield hit points will be going down from 892 to 824, and then the hit points of the actual cannon itself will be increased from 820 to 824. So now both of those values are the exact same. And also, just so you know, any stats we will be going over in this video are going to be at level 11 or tournament standard. The Fisherman is getting a nerf where the slow duration after he pulls in a troop will be nerfed by 40%. So after he pulls in a troop, that troop that he pulls in can then attack back much quicker. The Goblinstein is getting a much deserved nerf where the Doctor's hit points are being decreased by 19%. This lowers his hit points from 885 to 721, meaning that it now dies to poison. Next up, we have the Ram Rider getting a 4% HP nerf. This really isn't anything crazy, but the Ram Rider has been pretty good recently, so this should help tone her down a little bit. Next up, the Evolved Bomber got a nerf to the point where one of its attacks can't damage an enemy troop twice. Even though this was announced in this wave of balance changes, it's actually already been in the game for like a few weeks now. So yeah. Next up, the Evo Goblin Barrel is getting a nerf where there will now be a visual indicator for the decoy barrel to let you know which one is the decoy. I'm sorry, but I don't actually have any gameplay to show you, but it'll be a lot easier to differentiate between the two. Next up, we have a nerf and a rework for the Evo Ice Spirit. First of all, the amount of ice blasts that it does will be nerfed from 3 down to 2. But to compensate for that, the damage of each ice blast will be buffed by 48%. So that brings each ice blast from 110 damage to 163 damage. Next up, we have the Evo Pekka, and it is getting a really interesting rework to the point where the HP that it regains will depend on the troop that it kills. So there are 3 different categories: small characters, medium characters, and large characters. Small characters are classified as less than 990 HP. Medium characters are between 991 and 1989. And then large characters are anything greater than 1990. And then the amount that it will heal per these characters will be on the screen right now. This one is really interesting to me, and I'm really intrigued to see how it's going to play out. Next up, the evolved and non-evolved Royal recruits are getting 3 changes. The evolved recruits will have a 33% nerf to their charge range and also a 1% nerf to their charge damage. And then the regular Royal recruits will actually have a 4% damage buff. Looking at the evolved skeletons, they are getting a big nerf. Instead of having 4 skeletons, there will now be only 3 of them. That keeps it consistent with the normal skeletons, but that is a massive nerf to the evolved skeletons. So that's all the major nerfs that we're getting. Now we're on to the buffs. First up, for the baby dragon, it is getting a 25% buff to its splash radius. Next up, we have the witch, and she is also getting a buff to her splash radius, but this time by 50%. Next up, the dark prince is getting a 50% reduction to its charge range, so it's going to charge much sooner. The Electro Giant is also getting a buff to its sight range. Basically, this is just so to make it that it'll be consistent with other wind conditions and not attack other buildings that are too far away. Again, I don't really have any gameplay to show this, but just take my word, it's a buff for the Electro Giant. Next up, the Goblin Demolisher is getting a buff to its lifetime after it goes beneath 50 HP, and it will be a 14% buff. The Goblin Machine is getting a series of buffs. Its normal damage is getting a 57% buff. It is also getting a 33% buff to its hit speed, meaning it will attack much faster, and also its damage per second will be increasing from 150 to 176, which is a 17% increase. Next up, the Mighty Miner is getting a buff to its attack, so that way it will ramp up faster and be consistent with the Inferno Dragon and Inferno Tower. The Mini Pekka is getting a 5% damage buff. The Evolved Cannon is getting a 10% buff to its barrage damage. The Evolved Wall Breakers are getting a 50% buff to their death damage. However, this will not affect crown towers, just troops and buildings. items. And then the Dagger Duchess is getting a buff. She will now have a max dagger count of 9 instead of 8. And then her projectile speed is also being increased, which is classified as a bug fix. And then this last change they classify as a rework, and it is for the Lumberjack. The duration of its rage is being nerfed by 8%, and also that balance keeps the duration of the rage spell consistent with the actual 2 elixir spell. And then the Lumberjack is also getting a 5% damage buff. This is a massive wave of balance changes. It is sure to have a massive impact in the game's meta, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think will be the most impactful. But anyway, if you're new here, be sure to like, don't forget to subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you all in the next video.